Episode 2 of Parkinson Weekly. Did you think that a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease is stable as a rock and always correct? Maybe not. Listen to episode 2 of Parkinson Weekly. Good day, everyone. Welcome back on Parkinson Weekly. My name is Bas Bloem, and as I promised, we'll do a weekly article that somehow drew my attention and that may impact your clinical practice. And certainly this week's paper is one that will hopefully resonate with you. It was called Stability and Accuracy of a Diagnosis of Parkinson's Disease over 10 years. It was a Finnish group that led this article. And I like this article because we think that Parkinson's disease is a straightforward diagnosis, and it isn't. We know that in clinical trials even, 15% of diagnoses are wrong. And typically these diagnoses are made by experts in movement disorders. And we know that in community-based hospitals, during the first visit, when obviously the clinical picture hasn't fully evolved, the misclassification rate is maybe even up to 50%. And what I liked about this study from Finland is they used a very consistent methodology and a nationwide registry and looked at people with Parkinson's disease, sizable number, about 1,600 of them, and looked back at the charts and studied how often the diagnosis was changed in the course of the disease. So essentially they had 1,600 patients with a diagnosis code of Parkinson's disease. And these people, they had data from the medical records for up to 10 years in about 1,400 individuals. So this is a large sample size, which is what I liked about the study. And the main finding is actually quite striking. The diagnosis had to be revised in up to 17.7% of cases. That's almost 1 in 5 in the course of 10 years. And the most commonly made errors, and I think many of you who work in Parkinson's care will recognize this, was vascular Parkinsonism, which, by the way, vascular lesions may frequently overlap with what is otherwise bona fide Parkinson's disease. It was PSP, MSA, or dementia with Lewy bodies. And they also looked at post-mortem neuropathology, because this is all the honest opinion of a clinician, which is still only the silver standard diagnosis. The penultimate diagnosis of Parkinson's or any of the alternative diagnoses is obviously post-mortem neuropathology. Now, this was conducted in only 3%. I remember when I was trained as a registrar, it was compulsory to ask for post-mortem brain donations. Now, these days, it is no longer, but still, we need clinical pathological correlations to improve our clinical diagnostic reasoning. So they had this in only 3%, which isn't much. And the misclassification rate post-mortem was 36%. So only 64% of people diagnosed during life, including the 10-year follow-up, as having Parkinson's disease, had that disease, and 36% had something else. They looked at age. There's a figure in the paper showing that in general, misclassification was a bit higher for older individuals, but if you look at the data, it really doesn't make a difference in clinical practice. Gender or sex, if you will, did not make a difference in the misclassification rate. But what is interesting, they also looked at DAT imaging. And the more often DAT imaging, dopamine transporter imaging, which is a way of imaging the presynaptic dopaminergic system, the more often that scan had been performed, the more often the diagnosis had to be revised. But of course, this is circle reasoning, because if you're in doubt, you're more likely to perform a dopamine transporter scan. And what is interesting, if the DAT imaging result had to be revised, then the diagnosis was more often had to be changed. Now, you might think, and we're now moving into the implications for your clinical practice, that you should rely on dopamine transporter scans, and please don't. I was an author on the International Diagnostic Criteria for Parkinson's disease, and the criteria explicitly argue against using dopamine transporter scans. Why? Parkinson's is a clinically based diagnosis. DUT scans will most often not help you in the distinction between the diagnoses that I just mentioned and Parkinson's disease. The exception maybe being vascular Parkinsonism, where the lesions tend to be postsynaptic. But as I said, vascular Parkinsonism and Parkinson's disease frequently overlap. I think DUT scans are made way too often. They don't really help you in the distinction between atypical Parkinsonism, which was the issue here in this Finnish study, and Parkinson's disease. I use DUT scans if I doubt whether it is Parkinsonism to begin with, in all its forms, or perhaps dystonia, where the clumsiness may be mistaken for bradykinesia. So I think DUT scans were used maybe too often. What I liked about the study was the size, the sample size, the fact that the data were collected in Finland in such a systematic and consistent way. The weakness, of course, this is a Finnish study. It tells you something about clinical practice in Finland. It may be different in England. It may be different in the United States. It may be different in China. There were mainly white individuals. This is a problem in most studies. So the generalizability of the study remains limited. It was a hospital-based study, so misclassification rates may be much higher, for example, in nursing homes or in private practices. And some people were still alive at the time when the study was concluded. So some of those folks may go on to still have a wrong diagnosis. So I think what we're seeing here is perhaps even an underestimate. And of course, this was a retrospective analysis, again, of a very consistent and well-documented database, but retrospective nevertheless. So missing data, etc., were hampering the study. So the impact for your clinical practice is, A, you have to be aware that your diagnosis will remain uncertain, and time helps. In this particular study, most revisions of the diagnosis were made in the first few years, and this is also my experience. So time helps. I think it's helpful to communicate to your patients that you may be in doubt and that there is a certain degree of uncertainty. And the longer the disease persists, the more certain you will be about the diagnosis. But even in this Finnish study, people who were followed for 8, 9, 10 years could still have the wrong diagnosis. Stick to the diagnostic criteria. Use the MDS diagnostic criteria for Parkinson's disease faithfully. That is a clinically based diagnosis. You can use an MRI if you're in doubt, because that, to my mind, is helpful in doubtful cases. DUT scans only if you're in doubt whether it is Parkinsonism or perhaps something else. Maybe sometimes in vascular Parkinsonism. And again, follow-up and the response to levodopa, of course, will also be very helpful. So modesty for all of us. An important study, which I hope will help you in your clinical practice when you're seeing patients and in your communication about the diagnosis.
You've been listening to Parkinson Weekly with Bas Bloem. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe now so you never miss the latest in Parkinson's research, and share it with friends, colleagues, or anyone who loves a good brain story. Join us next week for another article that may impact the care for people with Parkinson's disease.